You ever throw a man out without knowing who he is? The bell above the gun shop door gave a dull, metallic chime as it swung shut, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the low hum of overhead fluorescent lights and the faint, familiar scent of gun oil hanging in the air. Jake Reynolds stood behind the glass counter with his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set tight in a mask of professional impatience. His eyes were fixed on the old man now standing outside on the sun-bleached concrete, looking at him as if he had just removed a persistent stain and expected the world to move on without a second thought. The glass door trembled once in its frame before settling, leaving Thomas Whitaker on the wrong side of it. His reflection was a faint, ghostly overlay against the rows of polished steel and matte black rifles arranged with obsessive symmetry inside the shop. Thomas didn't knock. He didn't argue. He didn't even turn back to plead his case. He simply stood there, his shoulders slightly stooped under a faded canvas jacket that had seen more winters and more battlefields than most of the men inside that shop had been alive. The late afternoon heat was already rising off the asphalt in shimmering waves, distorting the edges of the world and making the moment feel distant even as it happened. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. A couple of customers shifted uncomfortably on their feet, pretending to examine optics and ammunition boxes, while their eyes kept drifting toward the door. They knew something about the silence felt wrong. It wasn't empty, it was heavy, like the static in the air before a storm that hadn't decided whether to break. Jake exhaled sharply, a sound of pure dismissal, and reached for a microfiber rag. He began wiping down the glass counter with quick, aggressive movements as if he could scrub the very memory of the old man away. "We got policies for a reason," he muttered, his voice carrying that sharp edge of authority that comes from ownership and the arrogant belief that a deed to a building was enough to judge a man's worth. He shook his head, a faint, mocking scoff slipping through his teeth. Guy didn't even know what he was looking at. He was staring at the Barrett like it was a piece of alien technology. Some people just wander in here thinking this is a museum for their nostalgia. A few thin, forced chuckles slipped through the room from the hangers-on, but the laughter didn't quite land. It felt hollow against the backdrop of the man standing still outside. Jake kept scrubbing the same spot, his movements becoming sharper, more forceful than necessary, trying to ignore the fact that the old man hadn't moved an inch, standing like a monument to a history Jake couldn't understand. A young Marine named Miller had been watching the exchange from the back of the shop longer than he realized. His own reflection was faint in the glass, his eyes staying fixed on the old man outside. It wasn't the man's age or his worn clothes that caught Miller's attention, it was the total absence of a reaction. Miller had seen men get angry when disrespected, he'd seen them shrink in shame or lash out in a desperate attempt to reclaim their dignity. But this was none of that. This was something controlled, something measured, a level of discipline that felt hauntingly familiar. His boots shifted slightly against the polished floor, the sound of rubber on linoleum echoing in the tense shop as he leaned a fraction closer to the window, his focus narrowing until the rest of the store faded into a blur. "You planning on buying something, or just staring at the sidewalk all day?" Jake's voice cut across the room, sharper this time, pulling a few glances back toward the counter. Miller didn't answer immediately. His gaze had drifted to the worn leather pouch resting against the old man's hip. The edges were smoothed by decades of handling, the stitching faded but perfectly intact. It wasn't the kind of wear you see on a mass-produced item, it was the kind of patina that came from being used in places where equipment failure meant death. Something in Miller's chest tightened, not fear, but a spark of recognition trying to take a definitive shape. "Hey!" Jake barked again, tapping the glass with his knuckles. Impatience was bleeding into every movement he made. "We don't do window shopping like that. You got business, you bring it to the counter, otherwise, clear the floor." Miller blinked, pulling himself back into the present, his jaw setting as he looked Jake dead in the eye. "Yeah," he said finally, his tone even but no longer casual, "just looking." Jake gave a short, dismissive laugh and turned away, already deciding Miller was just another dreamer. Outside, the sun hung lower, stretching long, jagged shadows across the parking lot. Tom Whitaker had not moved. He stood as if time itself moved differently around him, his gaze resting on a specific rifle rack inside, not searching, but observing with a master's eye. Miller turned and walked toward the door, the bell chiming softly as he stepped into the heavy, late afternoon heat. "Sir," he called out. Tom didn't turn right away, not out of defiance, but because nothing moved with urgency in his world anymore. When he did look back, his pale eyes settled on Miller with a calm that made the younger man straighten his spine without thinking. "That pouch," Miller said, hesitating as he gestured toward the hip. "Where did you get it?" Tom looked down at the leather, then back up. "A long time ago," he said, his voice low and steady like the hum of a well-tuned engine. Miller took a breath. "You served, didn't you?" Tom held his gaze for a long moment before giving a small, imperceptible nod. "Once," he replied, and the word felt like it carried the weight of a century. Miller stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the heat pressing against his back, the weight of something unspoken settling deeper in his chest as he watched Tom Whitaker turn his gaze back toward the horizon. He wasn't being dismissive, he was just finished with the conversation in a way that felt absolute. That was when the shop door swung open again, the bell chiming with an irritating sharpness as Jake Reynolds stepped out onto the concrete. His boots hit the ground with more force than needed, his face flushed with annoyance. "We doing interviews out here now?" Jake asked, his voice louder in the open air, carrying that same arrogant edge. He glanced between Miller and Tom, already categorizing them as a pair of nuisances. "Look, I don't care what story he's telling you," Jake continued, folding his arms. "I run a business, not a veterans hall. If he wants to stand out here all day, that's his problem, but don't block my entrance." Miller's head turned slightly toward Jake, his eyes cold. "He isn't blocking anything," he said, his voice controlled but lacking the ease it had earlier. Jake let out a short, mocking laugh. "Right. Because standing here staring at rifles he can't afford is perfectly normal behavior." The words were sharp, meant to humiliate, but Tom didn't react. He stood still, his hands at his sides, looking through the window at the same rifle, a custom-built long-range precision platform, as if the insults around him were just background noise. Miller realized then that this wasn't submission, it was a man who had endured far worse than the words of a petty shopkeeper. Miller stepped a few feet away, turning his back to create a pocket of space. His phone was already in his hand. He dialed a number he didn't use lightly, and the line connected with a sharp click. "Staff Sergeant Cole," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming tight and precise. "I need you to listen carefully. I'm at a civilian shop off Route 17. I think I just ran into Cyan Hand Whitaker." "Yes, Thomas Whitaker." There was a pause on the other end, a silence so heavy Miller could feel the shift in atmosphere miles away. Cole's voice came back, no longer casual, but vibrating with a sense of emergency. "Stay exactly where you are, Miller. Do not let him walk off. We've been tracking every lead on him for 10 years. If that's really him, you're looking at a man who belongs to the history books. I'm escalating this to the colonel now." Miller lowered the phone, his grip tightening around the device. He looked back at Tom, who was still standing in the sun, unaffected by the invisible chain of command that had just been set in motion because of a single name. The weight of the moment did not stay in the parking lot, it shifted inward, carried in the quiet motion of Tom Whitaker's hand as it brushed the worn leather pouch at his side, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but for him it was not present, it was memory, and in that instant the heat rising off the asphalt faded into something older, harsher, the air thick with dust and the sharp metallic tang of oil baked under a relentless desert sun, the horizon wavering at over 100 degrees, a convoy stalled along a narrow strip of broken road where nothing was supposed to fail and yet something had, a rifle laid across the hood of a vehicle, not destroyed, not useless, but wrong in a way that did not show on the surface, a failure measured in fractions, in timing, in the difference between holding position and losing it when seconds mattered most, voices nearby tight but controlled, radio chatter cutting through bursts of static, a young officer standing just a few feet away trying to hold the situation together with confidence that had not yet been tested. And Tom, younger then but carrying the same stillness, stepped forward without asking, without announcing, moving with a certainty that did not need permission, his hands opening the pouch with a soft snap, revealing tools that had never belonged to any standard issue, pieces shaped by years of quiet fixes and hard-earned understanding. he selected one without hesitation, knelt beside the rifle, and began to work, not fast, never rushed, but exact, each movement deliberate, aligning something unseen, correcting something no manual would have caught, while the seconds stretched longer than they should have, while the officer's voice tightened just slightly behind him, holding position, holding control, waiting, and then it happened, not with noise, not with any dramatic shift, just a quiet return, a mechanism settling into place the way it was always meant to, the difference invisible to most but absolute to those who understood. Tom closed the pouch again, the snap sealing it with the same soft certainty, and the officer stepped closer, his voice lower now, steadier, but changed in a way that carried recognition. "You just bought us time," he said, not as praise but as truth, and Tom did not answer because he never did when it mattered, and back in the present the memory faded without resistance, leaving only the weight of it behind, carried in that same worn leather pouch, a small thing that had once made the difference between holding the line and losing it, and somewhere beyond the quiet street and the glass storefront, there was a man who had never forgotten exactly what that moment had cost, and exactly what it had saved. The shift did not happen where they stood, it happened somewhere else entirely, in a quiet office where the air was still and the only sound was the steady ticking of a wall clock, where a staff sergeant stood with a phone pressed to his ear, his posture straightening. The moment the name settled into place, not as information but as something heavier, something that carried history with it. "Say that again," he said, slower now, each word measured, and when the name came back the same, clear and deliberate, the room seemed to tighten around it, his eyes moving to a folder on the corner of his desk, one he had seen before but never needed to open. His hand reaching for it now with a hesitation that was not uncertainty but respect, flipping it open just enough to confirm what he already knew, the name printed there, not in bold, not highlighted, but unmistakable, and his breath left him slowly as he closed it again. "Stay where you are," he said into the phone, his tone no longer casual, no longer flexible, but directive, the kind that did not need explanation. The line ended and he was already moving, crossing the room in 3 quick steps. Another phone in his hand before the first had even cooled, dialing a number that did not get used lightly, the call connecting almost immediately. "Sir," he said, sharper now, controlled, "we may have a situation." There was a pause on the other end, not confusion, not hesitation, but attention, the kind that comes when a voice changes in a way that signals importance. "Name," came the response, short, precise, "Whitaker, Thomas Whitaker." The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, processing, and then something shifted, a chair moving, a breath taken, a decision forming. "Location," the voice said, already moving forward, coordinates given quickly, efficiently, and for a moment nothing else followed, then quieter, but with absolute clarity. "Do not let him leave." The line ended there, no questions, no discussion, just instruction, and across the distance the effect was immediate, orders moving with precision, vehicles being readied, personnel called, each step falling into place with the kind of efficiency that did not come from urgency but from understanding. Back at the shop the air had not changed yet, not visibly, but Cole felt it, something just beneath the surface, the kind of shift that comes before sound reaches you, before movement becomes visible, his eyes lifting briefly toward the road beyond the lot, then returning to Tom Whitaker, who had not moved, who stood exactly as he had before, unaffected by the chain that had just been set in motion because of him. Jake lingered near the door, his weight shifting slightly, glancing between the Marine and the old man with a growing unease he could not explain, the earlier confidence thinning just enough to be noticed. "You still here," he muttered, more to fill the silence than to challenge it, but no one answered, because something had already changed, not in words, not in action, but in the quiet certainty that whatever came next was no longer his to control, and somewhere down the road, beyond the bend where the heat blurred the horizon, something was already on its way. At first, it was just a sound, a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to hum through the very soles of Miller's boots. It was easy to ignore if you weren't listening for it, blending with the distant traffic beyond the lot. But Miller heard it, and his eyes narrowed toward the far stretch of road where heat waves blurred the horizon. Then, a shape appeared, dark and angular against the glare. Then another. And another. A line was forming where there had been nothing moments before, moving with a kind of purpose that made speed unnecessary. Inside the shop, the change came slower. A customer paused mid-motion with a box of ammo, another turned toward the window as the conversations died out, replaced by an encroaching sense of awe. Jake Reynolds followed their gaze, squinting into the sunlight. His irritation was slowly being replaced by a gnawing confusion as the vehicles became clearer. These weren't civilian trucks. Dark government plates caught flashes of light, and the windows were tinted a deep, impenetrable black. They moved as a single organism, aligned and precise, turning into the gravel lot without hesitation. The gravel crunched softly under the weight of heavy-duty tires as the three matte green Hums came to a stop exactly where they intended to be. The engines cut almost in unison, leaving a silence that felt charged with electricity. Miller didn't move. His posture was already set, his mind aligned with the protocols he knew were about to unfold. Tom Whitaker remained unchanged by the arrival, as if the armored vehicles were no more significant than the passing wind. The first heavy door opened with a muted, mechanical click, then another, then another. Boots met the pavement in a synchronized rhythm, not rushed, but possessing an inevitable weight. Marines emerged. Their uniforms crisp, catching the light in brief flashes. Their presence alone shifted the air, making the space around the shop feel smaller, more constrained. Jake felt his arms uncross without him even realizing it. His stance adjusted as if the ground beneath him had shifted. One of the customers inside took a step back from the window, not out of fear, but out of an instinctual need to make space for something larger than the room itself. The Marines didn't surround the shop, they simply aligned themselves, their focus narrowing naturally toward the single point that mattered, the old man in the canvas jacket. Jake stood frozen at the door, finally realizing that whatever control he thought he had over his domain had evaporated the moment those tires touched his gravel. The line of Marines, standing like statues in their crisp uniforms, parted without a single spoken command as one man stepped forward from the center of the formation. His movement was unhurried, each step measured and precise, cutting through the heavy stillness of the parking lot like a blade through silk. There was no question of who he was, the silver eagles pinned to his uniform caught the dying rays of the afternoon sun, casting a subtle but unmistakable glint that demanded immediate silence. This was Colonel Hayes, a man whose reputation preceded him in every mess hall and briefing room across the Corps. He didn't look at the gun shop, didn't acknowledge the curious customers pressed against the glass, and didn't even glance at Jake Reynolds, who was standing frozen near the doorway. His focus was locked entirely on Thomas Whitaker, as if the decades between them had collapsed into a single, burning point of recognition. He stopped exactly 3 feet away, the regulation distance for a formal encounter, yet it felt as intimate as a reunion between brothers. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing was said. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, not because there were no words, but because the history between these two men had already spoken first in the way they stood. Tom lifted his gaze, meeting the colonel's eyes with that same steady, unshakable calm that had defined him all day. Something passed between them, an unspoken understanding earned in the dirt, blood, and heat of places that the people in this small town couldn't even find on a map. "Colonel Hayes," Tom said quietly, his voice low but grounding the entire scene in reality. "Reporting, sir," Hayes replied, and the word "sir" landed with a weight that shifted the entire atmosphere of the street. Jake Reynolds felt the words hit like a physical blow to the chest. The blood drained from his face as the realization settled in, there was no doubt left, no room for his petty store policies or his arrogant assumptions. Hayes' eyes dropped briefly to the worn leather pouch at Tom's side, and for the first time, the colonel's disciplined mask slipped. A flicker of deep, painful memory crossed his expression before settling back into a look of profound respect. "You still carry it," he said, his voice dropping into a quieter, almost reflective tone. Tom's reply was as simple and honest as the man himself: "It still works. And if it still works, it still has a job to do." Hayes drew in a slow, deliberate breath, then turned his head slightly toward Jake for the first time. His gaze wasn't sharp or aggressive, it was worse. It was final, the kind of look a judge gives before passing a life sentence. "You threw out the man who kept my entire unit alive in '87, Hayes said, each word clear and measured, leaving absolutely no space for misunderstanding. "Our current long-range precision platforms are failing in the field because of a calibration error no computer can fix. There isn't a technician in the entire Marine Corps who possesses that steel touch required to bring those weapons back into the fight, except for the man you just called a vagrant. We have been searching for him across 3 states to save the lives of young men currently in the line of fire, and you treated him like trash on your porch." The silence that followed was absolute. Jake's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His throat felt as dry as the asphalt under his feet. His earlier certainty was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of his own ignorance. He looked at his hands, then at the shop he was so proud of, and suddenly it all looked small and insignificant. Colonel Hayes didn't wait for an apology that wouldn't mean anything anyway. He straightened his posture, aligning his spine with a code of honor deeper than any written protocol, and snapped a clean, razor-sharp salute. Behind him, as if moved by a single ghost string, every Marine in the lot followed suit. The sound of their hands hitting their brows was a single, synchronized crack that echoed off the brick walls of the shop. Tom Whitaker didn't return the salute immediately. He looked at the line of young men, boys, really seeing the future of the service in their determined eyes. He saw the same spark he had carried 40 years ago. Then, he gave the smallest, most humble incline of his head, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed by anyone who didn't understand the gravity of the moment. Only then did his hand rise, slower than the others, his joints stiff with age, but the motion was just as precise, returning the honor with the same quiet weight it had been given. When his hand lowered, the moment ended with a natural release of tension. "We never truly replaced you, Tom," Hayes said, his voice steady but carrying more meaning than the words alone. Tom shook his head slightly, a faint hint of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. "You weren't supposed to," he replied. He turned and walked toward the lead Humvee with measured steps, the line of Marines parting for him like a sea of green and tan, creating a path of honor that led away from the small-mindedness of the shop. Jake finally found his voice, a broken whisper of "I didn't know," but Tom just looked back one last time as he reached the vehicle door. "You weren't supposed to know who I am," Tom said softly, his voice carrying the finality of a closing chapter. "But you were supposed to know how to treat a human being." He stepped into the vehicle, the door closing with a heavy, armored thud. The engines roared to life, and as the convoy pulled away, casting long shadows across the pavement, Jake Reynolds was left standing in the dust of a legacy he would never understand and a respect he would never earn.